Pre-order my book, American Evil, in the description below. So right now, we're in this weird situation in which the gaming industry is desperately trying to downplay the failures of every other company in the industry while pretending that Nintendo is on the verge of bankruptcy, right? You may have seen like some comments on 4chan, and you may have seen like some journalists make statements about this, but essentially what it amounts to is that right now people are becoming aware that Xbox and PlayStation are failing, right? That is a commonly understood thing. I was talking about this a decade ago, but the rest of the industry is only just now catching up, right? People are beginning to admit that the AAA formula, the PlayStation and Xbox brand are not making anyone any money, and it's all collapsing, right? It is all just going downhill, down the toilet, right? It's done, right? But the thing is, and this has become very self-evident, a lot of these observations are incorrectly lumping in Nintendo with the failing platforms, right? You may have seen like some journalists or some articles release statements along the lines that every video game console, including Nintendo, are failing and going bankrupt. Like, it's interesting, right? Seeing these people directly call out Nintendo as also failing. It's very similar to how like people try to pretend that Nintendo is woke when that isn't true in any way, shape, or form. It's just hoping, right? The rest of the industry is desperate to see Nintendo fail when that is clearly not true in any way, shape, or form, right? Nintendo is making more money than ever, right? If you actually look at their metrics and how much they're pulling in and just how much they've successfully managed to expand their business, like through Amiibo, through merchandising, through the films, through the parks, like it's safe to say that Nintendo is in a position where they never have to worry about failing ever again, right? They are in a position now where they're basically ubiquitous in their demographic, right? They are video games in a way. But we're still in this period where like people are refusing to admit that, right? You know, how many people do you see like complain about Pokemon being baby's first RPG or like 2D Mario or The Legend of Zelda, right? You know, how many people like religiously try to pretend that the Tears of the Kingdom was not one of the best games released that last year, right? You know, it's all just flailing around trying to pretend that Nintendo isn't relevant or popular, but that really is observably not true, and we are going to see these notions be debunked over and over and over and over again. Now, Nintendo's success can be seen in a lot of different ways, right? You know, they're hiring people. Sales numbers are higher than ever. They've had a number of successes, like, you know, the Switch is well on its way to becoming the best-selling console ever, right? The thing is, though, right now, the narrative is that Capcom is doing well. That Capcom alone, out of every major video game publisher, is doing extraordinarily well, right? You're seeing people like make all these clickbait articles about how like, oh, Capcom's doing so well. They gave more money to shareholders, right? You know, you see people like trying to pretend to be excited for Monster Hunter Wild, which is not going to do as well as World. You're seeing people like just hype up like the Resident Evil 4 remake and Street Fighter 6. It's all been a complete disaster, right? The issue is, I think, is that Capcom alone, out of like the major third-party developers, has stayed relatively relevant over the past 5 years. You know, when you compare them to Square Enix and especially Konami, you know, the major pillars of PlayStation development, like Capcom has managed to stay somewhat relevant. And I think a big reason for that is because traditionally they have been the most supportive of Nintendo hardware. You know, Monster Hunter became popular in the West because of Nintendo's involvement, right? You know, Ace Attorney is big. You know, Beautiful Joe was developed. Resident Evil 4 premiered, was a Nintendo exclusive, right? Again, like Capcom has traditionally put quite a lot of effort into putting out really, really good Nintendo support. You know, there have been a lot of lapses and lulls and mistakes, you know, just like every major third-party studio, but Capcom has more than most companies done a lot to support Nintendo hardware. However, there is no denying that the company is no different than the rest of the industry, right? They are struggling, right? They are failing. They are going downhill, right? When you look at Dragon's Dogma 2 and how quickly that fell off the map, like you're not seeing a company that's doing well, right? You're seeing a company that's essentially coasting off of like blind fanboyism and loyalty from customers that have been there since the 90s, right? Capcom, in a way, is Capcom is essentially existing the way it is now because it has no real competition from other third parties. Like, if you only own a PlayStation, an Xbox, or a PC, like, what exactly else are you going to play? There's nothing from Namco Bandai, there's nothing from Sega, there's nothing from any of these companies, right? Capcom alone, you know, okay, at least we can expect a Monster Hunter every couple of years, right? Even if it's like a flop like World, right? Like even if it's like bad, at least it's like it hasn't completely fallen off the deep end yet, right? Like in a lot of ways, Capcom's in a better position now than they were like a decade ago. Remember like Bionic Commando and the whole wife being his arm thing? Like it's like yeah. But again, uh this is merely through by comparison, right? Compared to Nintendo, like Capcom is getting absolutely demolished. Every attempt they've made at trying to get PlayStation and Xbox to sell, to be relevant, has fallen completely flat on its face, right? They put out Exo Primal, they put out like, that weird lolly like escort girl game. I don't know what that is. Like again, like they put out Resident Evil remakes. They're straight up out of Resident Evil games to remake. Like they're gonna do the original, but the problem with that is that the original has been remade already by the original creator and is probably one of the best video game remakes ever made, right? So like again, Capcom essentially managed to milk its audience into relevancy and is now in this position where they're awaiting their fall. Essentially, they're in this position where people are hyping them up because they have nothing else, and eventually, when they go directly head to head with Nintendo, it's going to become very apparent that they can't sustain themselves and they can't remain relevant, right? Monster Hunter alone is not going to protect this company forever. In a lot of ways, I think Monster Hunter is becoming their equivalent of something like Dynasty Warriors or something like Call of Duty, right? The annual Madden sports franchises. Like all they have to do is just put out a new Monster Hunter, and people will just like, oh, the Capcom is the best. Like there's no real like discretion. There's no real like consideration of quality. Like how few people do you know who will acknowledge that like Monster Hunter Rise was way better than World, right? How many people are you seeing acknowledge that like Wilds has no hype behind it at all? And that people are only talking about it because like they're hoping that it'll like stomp Rise out of relevancy, right? Like like how exactly how long is it going to take before people realize that like Capcom isn't doing a lot to innovate. Like what new IPs are they putting out? Like what are they doing with Resident Evil or Mega Man or like anything else they own? Like the reality is like their IPs are stagnant and have been for a long time. It's crazy to think that like Resident Evil peaked with 4 aeons ago, or like 2 if you're a fan of the classic survival horror. Like again, like what are they doing to innovate? What are they going doing that's like fresh, new, and exciting? The reality is like essentially nothing. Like when you really look at like their upcoming release schedule and like everything they have on the horizon, like the reality is everyone's looking more forward to the next Nintendo thing, right? Capcom is putting out Monster Hunter Wilds, but it's going to get overshadowed by whatever Nintendo puts out on their next platform, right? What Nintendo announces this E3, right? Monster Hunter Wilds is not going to be able to compete with like the big new Nintendo games. In a lot of ways, it's not even competing with like 20-year-old ones, Like the Thousand Year Door actually beat Monster Hunter Wilds in like a Famitsu poll in Japan, right? To me, that's very telling as to like where the industry is headed, right? A port of a 20-year-old game, it's not even a good port. A really poorly done remaster of an overrated GameCube game, right? One of the most overhyped Nintendo games of all time. The Sonic Adventure of Mario, right? The autism magnet that is the Thousand Year Door. That is outperforming Monster Hunter, right? And it's not going to be alone, right? We're going to get more RPGs. We're going to get more spin-offs. We're going to get more Mario games, more games from Nintendo in general. What exactly is Capcom going to do to compete with that? The reality is, and this has been true for a long time, it can't, right? The situation now is that the only reason that people aren't aware that Nintendo is dominating the gaming industry is because, people like to consolidate all three of its primary competitors, like Xbox, PlayStation, and PC, right? If you actually look at the hard numbers, if you actually like compare like the relevancy of each platform, like a Nintendo Switch eclipses all of them pretty handedly. But the issue is that like everybody likes to say, I spend 10 hours a day looking at Pornhub and then another 5 hours leaving angry comments on Harmon Smith videos telling him that like PC gaming is superior. Like you you get stuff like that, right? You have like a warped perspective of what what like playing on PlayStation, Xbox, or PC is actually like, because those guys aren't playing games. They're watching movies, reacting to YouTube streams, like just not actually playing games, right? And again, Baldur's Gate 3 is a really good example of that, because when you actually look at the player base and what they're doing, like essentially what it amounts to is just like a dating sim for girls, essentially. Like it is Dragon Age Inquisition all over again. Is that like uh they just want like the degenerate sex like fantasy thing, and it's not a particularly good game, right? Like but it appeals to like a certain degenerate demographic, right? um I do think that's kind of where we're at now, right? Where right now it's like real serious gamers, Nintendo fans versus the most depraved, like delusional groups of people imaginable, right? And they can't win, right? When I see people like unironically like try to praise Nikke or like Stellar Blade or like uh uh Dragon's Dogma 2 or Tekken 8, like I just throw my head back and laughed because like Tekken 8, like nobody's playing that now. It came out this year and it's already irrelevant, right? Again, like, remember when Power World was supposed to eclipse Pokemon? Like what happened with that? Oh yeah, it was never going to happen. Like the reality is, like, the whole Capcom thing is just an attempt at deflecting attention away from Nintendo's continued success, right? It is an attempt at downplaying the fact that Nintendo is stomping Capcom, right? And there's really not much that the industry can do to kind of like deny this reality for much longer, because it is going to become apparent very quickly that Capcom will not be able to compete.